August 23, 1945, Camp Clinton, Mississippi. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Not rot, not damp wool, not the sour breath of too many bodies in a closed space. Soap. Clean, pale soap, sharp and unmistakable. The kind that cut through air instead of sinking into it. It drifted from somewhere ahead, carried by a door that had been left open too long, as if no one feared what might wander in. She slowed, without meaning to. Her boots stopped on the wooden floor, and the sound startled her, hollow confident. No squelch, no give. The boards didn't complain under her weight. They had been scrubbed recently. She could tell by the faint chalky residue caught in the seams. This was wrong. Behind her, other women continued forward, shuffling out of habit, eyes lowered, shoulders tight. The line had taught them how to move without looking, how to keep pace without thinking. But she stood there, caught between steps, unable to reconcile what her senses were reporting. A radio played somewhere to her left. Not loud, not hidden, just on. The thin, reedy sound of an AM station drifted across the room, riding the slow swing of a midday tune. Trumpets, light percussion, a rhythm meant for kitchens and open windows. The kind of music that assumed time existed beyond the next hour. Someone laughed briefly, then hushed themselves, not because a guard barked, but because laughter had sounded out of place to their own ears. She waited for the correction. It didn't come. The guard at the door leaned against the frame helmet, tilted back slightly, fingers hooked into his belt. He was watching the line, but not closely. His eyes slid past faces without counting them. He shifted his weight and glanced toward the radio, listening for the chorus like anyone else might. This was supposed to be a prison. She had rehearsed for this moment for weeks. On the transport, in the dark, in the thin hours before dawn when the air smelled of iron and old fear. She had prepared herself for shouting, for numbers replacing names, for the sharp economy of cruelty, quick, efficient, designed to teach lessons without words. Instead, there was coffee. She smelled it before she saw it, bitter and hot, poured too recently to have settled. The steam rose from a row of tin cups set out along a counter that bore no bars, no chain, no wire. Just wood, worn smooth where hands had rested, where elbows had leaned. A woman ahead of her reached for a cup without being told, then froze fingers hovering, waiting for a reprimand that didn't arrive. "Go on," someone said. The voice was ordinary, tired, American. The cup was heavier than she expected. Tin warmed by the liquid inside. She felt it through the fabric of her gloves and almost dropped it, startled by the simple fact of heat offered without negotiation. She did not drink. She stood there, holding it, staring at the surface of the coffee as it rippled, slightly disturbed by the radio's vibration through the counter. No one watched her reaction. No one measured compliance. Her mind searched for the angle, the trick. Kindness, she had been taught, was never free. It always arrived with a ledger, even if the debt was collected later, but the room refused to play its part. Light entered through high windows, unfiltered by grime or wire. Dust motes moved lazily, visible only because the glass had been cleaned. The air was warm, but not stale. It carried the faintest trace of something floral beneath the soap laundry, maybe. Or the memory of it. She set the cup down, untouched. Her hands were shaking, not with fear, with confusion. A guard passed behind her close enough that she felt the displacement of air, the brush of movement. He smelled of sweat and tobacco and something clean underneath. He did not slow, did not look, did not reach. This was not how power behaved where she came from. There, order announced itself with noise, with repetition, with the constant reminder that nothing was accidental. Here, order seemed to assume itself. The floor was clean because it was cleaned. The radio played because someone liked the music. The coffee was hot because someone had boiled water and not thought to withhold it. Her chest tightened not in panic but in resistance. If this place was gentle, then what did that make everything she had endured to arrive here? She moved again, stepping forward, the rhythm of the line reasserting itself. Her boots tapped the floor in time with the music. The sound bothered her more than the guards. It was too present, too loud. As they were directed toward the barracks, she noticed details she hadn't trained herself to see. A broom leaning in a corner, bristles worn evenly. A window cracked open for air. A bar of soap resting on a ledge, edges softened from use, not rationed into slivers. Ivory. She recognized it from a label glimpsed months ago in a shattered shop window somewhere along the route west. A thing from advertisements, from kitchens, from a life that assumed mornings would come. Her steps faltered again. This time she pressed her heel down, deliberately testing the floor. It held. The boards did not creak in protest. They accepted her weight without comment. She had expected resistance everywhere, objects included. Instead, the place absorbed her presence as if she belonged to the category of things that could be accounted for without force. A woman beside her whispered almost angrily, "Don't trust it." She nodded without turning her head. Trust was not the issue. Understanding was. If this was captivity, it did not announce itself as such. It did not demand acknowledgement. It simply functioned, and that more than barbed wire or shouted orders unsettled her, because systems like this did not need cruelty to sustain themselves. As the door to the barracks opened, releasing another clean, ordinary smellwood soap sunlight, she felt a thought form before she could stop it. This doesn't look like a prison. The realization landed quietly. No drama, no revelation. Just a small, persistent wrongness that refused to resolve. And for the first time since she had been taken, she was not afraid of what might happen next. She was afraid that nothing would. The fear didn't arrive loudly. It crept in the way a draft finds a crack in a wall, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore, once felt. After the barracks lights went out that first night, she lay on her back, staring into the dark eyes, open, listening. Not for footsteps, not for shouting, but for the moment the tone would change. It didn't. The radio down the row clicked off at a reasonable hour. Somewhere, water ran briefly, then stopped. A door closed. Wood against wood. Careful, considerate. She waited for the correction. It never came. That was when the fear began to take shape. In the morning, they were fed again. Bread with a crust that cracked when torn. A pale interior still warm at the center. The smell alone made her throat tighten. She ate slowly, counting bites, watching faces. No one rushed them. No one stood over them with a stopwatch or a rifle. When she finished, there was still food left on the tray. That terrified her. She folded the extra piece of bread with practiced hands, slid it into the inside pocket of her jacket, and smoothed the fabric flat. The habit was older than the war. Food disappeared quickly in her world. It always had. That night she slept with her boots on. The laces dug into her ankles. Her toes went numb. She didn't care. Shoes meant readiness. Shoes meant you could move when the moment came, when the shouting started, when the doors opened too fast, when kindness revealed its true purpose. In places like this, she knew generosity was never neutral. Cleanliness was not comfort. It was control. Good food was not mercy. It was strategy. She had been taught that since the beginning, soften them first. Confuse them. Make them forget who they are. Then take what remains. So she watched. She watched how often the guards changed shifts, how they leaned against walls without scanning the room, how they spoke to each other about ordinary things, weather trucks, a letter that hadn't come yet. She listened for coded language, for the undercurrent of threat. All she heard was routine. That made her skin crawl. On the third day, a board appeared near the mess hall. A sheet of paper tacked neatly at eye level. Names listed in columns. Beside them, assignments. Times, locations, no explanations, no warnings. She stood back, letting others move closer first. The paper was clean edges, sharp, fresh ink. Someone had taken the time to write clearly. Her name was there. Next to it, farm detail. DO 600. Her breath shortened. This was it. Not punishment, worse. Removal. Disappearance dressed up as usefulness. She imagined trucks pulling out beyond the gates, dust-rising roads stretching into places that did not return prisoners. She slept even less that night. At dawn, engines started. Not one. Several. She watched through the window as trucks rolled into place, aligned with a precision that felt rehearsed but not theatrical. Canvas sides, wooden beds, tires thick and clean. They idled without hurry, as if they had nowhere else urgent to be. The men driving them did not shout. They checked lists, looked at watches, tapped ash from cigarettes. One glanced up at the sky, squinting, judging the heat. Time mattered here. Not because someone demanded it, but because the day was organized around it. She climbed into the truck with the others' boots scraping wood hands gripping the side rails. No one tied them down. No one counted heads twice. As they pulled away, she watched the camp recede, not with relief, but with a tightening sense of exposure. Inside the wire, at least the rules were visible. Outside, anything could happen. The road was smooth. That unsettled her more than potholes would have. They passed fields already worked soil turned in even rows, fences straight, gates repaired where they had sagged. She noticed these things because she could not afford not to. Order meant planning. Planning meant intention. The truck stopped beside a farmhouse that looked like it had been standing long before the war and would remain long after. White paint, a porch swept clean. Tools leaned against a wall, not locked away, just placed where they belonged. A man waited near the barn. No uniform, no weapon. Sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked at the truck, nodded once, and gestured toward the field. No speech, no warning. Work began. She expected shouting when someone moved too slowly, expected punishment when instructions were misunderstood. Instead, mistakes were corrected with hands and gestures. A post-driven crooked was pulled out and reset. A bucket carried wrong was handed back without comment. The rhythm was relentless but fair. Breaks came when the sun reached certain points in the sky. Water was cold. Cups were refilled without question. This, too, frightened her, because cruelty at least announced itself. You could brace for it. You could hate it. This was something else. By midday, her body ached in places she hadn't felt since before the war. Honest ache. The kind that came from exertion, not fear. Sweat ran down her back, darkening the fabric. She wiped her hands on her trousers and realized with a jolt of suspicion that no one had searched her jacket. The bread was still there. At lunch, food appeared again. Not ceremonially, not as a demonstration. It was simply placed where workers gathered as if the connection between labor and nourishment required no commentary. She ate, then stopped, then wrapped what remained and hid it again. That night, lying on a bunk that smelled faintly of soap and sun-warmed wood, she stared at the ceiling and tried to assemble the pieces into something that made sense. Why bother feeding prisoners well if you plan to break them? Why keep time so precisely if chaos was the goal? The clock on the wall ticked softly. Its second hand moved without hesitation, without drama. It did not speed up to intimidate. It did not stall to threaten. It simply kept going. That was the most dangerous thing of all, because systems like this didn't rely on fear to function. They relied on people showing up, on work being done, on days following each other in a sequence that assumed continuity. She realized then what frightened her most. Not that she would be hurt, but that she might begin to believe this was normal, that her guard might lower not because someone forced it down, but because there was nothing to push against. She turned onto her side boots, still on bread hidden against her ribs, and pressed her face into the pillow. If kindness was the weapon, then it was the sharpest one she had ever seen, and she was not sure she knew how to defend against it. The truck didn't turn toward another fence. That was the first sign. She noticed it before anyone said a word, felt it in the angle of the road, the way the horizon opened instead of narrowing. The camp disappeared behind them, not with the snap of a gate, but with distance. Wood gave way to dirt. Barbed wire gave way to grass that rolled uninterrupted until it met the sky. No one told them where they were going. That made it worse. She stood in the back of the truck, fingers curled around the side rail, boots braced against the vibration of the road. No chains rattled. No one counted them again. The guard at the front sat sideways on the bench, one arm hooked casually, his rifle resting where it could be reached, but wasn't. She waited for the moment the truck would stop abruptly, for shouted instructions, for the correction that would finally make sense of the last few days. Instead, the engine slowed naturally as if arriving somewhere expected. The ranch announced itself without ceremony. A low house, white paint dulled by sun, a porch with two chairs turned slightly inward as if someone had been sitting there just moments before. A barn set back from the road, doors open. Horses shifting their weight lazily in the shade. No watchtower, no perimeter. The truck rolled to a stop, and for a long second, nothing happened. Then, a man stepped out from the barn. He wore boots, jeans, and a shirt darkened with sweat at the collar. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his eyes. He did not approach the truck immediately. He looked at the sky, first gauging the heat, then at the fields. Only then did his gaze settle on them. He didn't smile. He nodded once. That was all. No one ordered them down. They climbed off because there was nothing else to do. The ground was hard-packed dirt warm through the soles of her boots. Cicadas screamed from somewhere unseen, a constant metallic pulse that filled the air the way artillery once had, only this sound had no edge to it. It did not warn. It simply existed. The man spoke, but not to them directly. "Food's ready." The words were plain, unadorned. They landed with more force than any command. She felt it immediately, the reflexive tightening in her chest, the instinct to refuse. Eat later. Work first. Prove worth. That was how punishment places operated. But he had already turned away, walking toward the house as if the matter were settled. On the porch, a table had been set. Not arranged, set. Cast iron skillets rested directly on the wood, still faintly sizzling. The smell hit her in a wave so sudden she stopped short, throat tightening before she could stop it. Beef. Thick cuts, seared dark at the edges, resting in their own juices. Potatoes beside them, skins, split steam escaping through the cracks. A pitcher of milk sweating in the heat, condensation running down its sides and pooling on the table. No one said grace. No one explained. Plates were handed out not ceremonially, not as a demonstration, but the way food was handed to people who were expected to eat it. She took hers with hands that did not quite feel like her own. The first bite was a mistake. She knew it the moment her teeth broke through the meat, releasing heat and salt and something deeper, fat maybe, or memory. Her body reacted before her mind could intervene. Her jaw worked, swallowed. She stopped chewing. For a heartbeat she was certain this was it, that the cost would reveal itself immediately. Nothing happened. Across from her another woman stared at her plate as if it might move. Someone else ate quickly, eyes darting, ready to be corrected. The man in the hat sat down at the far end of the table with his own plate. He ate without looking at them, cutting his steak with the practiced economy of someone who had done this every day of his adult life. He drank milk directly from a glass, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and stood again. "Finish up," he said. "Sun's already climbing." That was it. No warning about behavior, no speech about cooperation, just an expectation that the sequence would continue. Work followed food, not punishment, work. She was handed a post driver, shown how to use it by demonstration, not instruction. The man took it from her hands, lifted it once, let it drop cleanly onto the post. Straight, efficient. Then he stepped aside and nodded for her to try. Her first attempt went crooked. The post tilted. He didn't react. He simply lifted it out, set it again, and stepped back. Her second attempt held. That earned another nod. The day unfolded without markers of cruelty. Time passed according to the sun and the rhythm of tasks. Fences were repaired, buckets filled, gates opened and closed. No one rushed her. No one hovered. At noon, they stopped. Water was poured, cups refilled. She noticed then how many small things had been left within reach tools, ropes, even the horses standing unattended near the fence. Trust lay everywhere unguarded like a test no one announced. The hat hung from a post near the barn, its shape unmistakable. She found herself looking at it more than once, not because it was strange, but because it was ordinary. It belonged to a world where work ended and someone went inside at night. As the heat peaked, the insects grew louder, filling the space between tasks. The sound pressed in from all sides, not threatening, just present. She wiped sweat from her neck and realized no one had told her when she could. No one had to. Late in the afternoon, she felt the ache settle fully into her muscles. It was the first honest exhaustion she had known in years, the kind that did not carry fear with it, only consequence. When the work stopped, it stopped cleanly. Tools were leaned where they belonged, buckets emptied, hands washed at a pump whose handle bore the polish of use. Dinner appeared without announcement. The same skillet. New meat. Bread, this time crusty and warm. She ate slower now. Not because she was afraid, because she was trying to understand. No one spoke about politics. No one mentioned the war. No one asked where she was from or what she believed. The man talked briefly about weather coming later in the week, about a fence line that would need attention tomorrow. That was the extent of the exchange. When the sun dropped and the air cooled, they were shown where they would sleep. A bunkhouse set back from the main house. Clean, spare, windows open to the evening, no lock. She lay on the mattress and stared at the ceiling, listening to the night settle. The insects softened their song. Somewhere, an animal shifted in its sleep. Her boots were off. She realized that only when she moved her feet and felt the unfamiliar softness of the blanket. The thought came unbidden, unwelcome, and impossible to dismiss. This place did not seem interested in breaking her. It seemed interested in using her time, and feeding her for it. She did not know what frightened her more, that this kindness was temporary, or that it might not be. Because if this was how things worked, here if work truly came before punishment, then everything she had prepared herself to endure had been built for the wrong kind of enemy. And she had no script for what came next. The next morning was the moment she expected everything to change. She woke before the other's heart already tight, waiting for the correction, the delayed consequence, the realization that yesterday had been an exception, an experiment, a test, a mistake that would be fixed. It didn't come. The air smelled the same, dust and grass, faint smoke from a stove already lit. The insects were quieter now, settling into the cooler hour before heat returned. Somewhere near the house, a door opened and closed with the same unremarkable sound it had made the day before. No whistle. No shouted order. Breakfast was already on the table when she stepped outside. The same skillet, the same thickness of meat, potatoes again split and steaming, coffee poured into the same tin cups set in the same places without anyone marking them. She froze for a second plate in her hands. This was the danger. Not cruelty, not hunger, not punishment, repetition. She ate, waiting for eyes to linger on her, for someone to watch the way she held the fork, the speed at which she swallowed. No one did. The man in the hat read a folded newspaper while he drank his coffee, eyes scanning columns without urgency. The radio murmured from the kitchen window. A voice spoke about production somewhere far away, about factories running through the night, about ships leaving ports faster than they could be named. The words drifted across the yard and dissolved into the morning like they were weather reports, not triumphs. No one stopped to listen. No one pointed at the radio and said, "This is why." It was just noise that filled the space between tasks. Work began when breakfast ended, not because anyone announced it, but because hands naturally reached for tools. The fence line was the same one she had worked on yesterday. The post she had driven crooked was still straight. The gate still swung cleanly on its hinge. She lifted the driver. Her body remembered what to do. That realization unsettled her more than exhaustion ever had. Hours passed in a rhythm so steady it blurred. The sun climbed. Sweat returned. Water was poured. A break came when it was needed, not when it was demanded. No one corrected her posture. No one praised her improvement. She was simply expected to continue. At midday, the food appeared again unchanged. She ate because it was there, because it was time, because the sequence required it. The man spoke briefly about moving cattle tomorrow, about a fence farther out that needed attention. His voice carried no sense of instruction meant to teach a lesson. He was not managing prisoners. He was managing a day. She realized then what had been missing since her arrival. Performance. No one here seemed interested in how she felt about any of this. No one asked if she understood why things were done this way. No one tried to demonstrate virtue through action or explanation. They did not need her acknowledgement. The radio spoke again in the afternoon, its tone unchanged. More talk of output, of schedules, of places she would never see. The words stacked on top of each other, matter-of-fact, uncelebrated. She imagined a man somewhere tightening a bolt, another stacking crates, another checking a watch before nodding once and moving on. The sound was not triumphant. It was procedural. That frightened her. Because where she came from, order demanded constant reinforcement. It required banners and speeches and reminders of purpose. It needed an enemy to justify itself. Here, order existed without commentary. Tools were put away because they were finished being used. Floors were swept because dirt accumulated. Food was cooked because people would need it again tomorrow. No one stood back to admire the system. They lived inside it. Late in the afternoon, she noticed the clock on the wall of the barn. Its face was smudged hands dark against a pale background. The second hand moved steadily, never hesitating, never racing to impress. Time passed whether anyone watched it or not. That night she lay on her bunk listening to the sounds she was beginning to recognize. A distant engine shutting down. A door closing gently. The radio clicking off at the same hour as before. The insects rising again in the dark, their rhythm unchanged. Her boots were off again. She stared at them on the floor, placed neatly where she had left them. She did not remember deciding to remove them. Her body had done it without consulting her fear. The thought unsettled her enough that she sat up. What frightened her now was not that this place would turn on her. It was that it would not. Days continued like this. Breakfast, work, heat, water, lunch, more work, evening, no escalation, no revelation, no moment she could point to and say, this is when it became something else. That was the shock, because she had been trained to believe that power always needed to announce itself, that systems required constant proof of dominance, that kindness, if it existed at all, was a performance meant to deceive. Here there was no audience. She began to notice the small inefficiencies that proved the system wasn't staged. A fence repaired twice because the first fix wasn't good enough. A meal slightly overcooked eaten anyway without complaint. A tool misplaced and found later returned to its hook without comment. Nothing was perfect. Nothing needed to be. One afternoon, she caught herself matching her pace to the man working beside her without thinking. Their movements synchronized not because of command, but because it was easier that way. The realization stopped her mid-step. She stood there, heart-pounding driver in her hands, suddenly aware of what was happening. This place was not asking for her belief. It was absorbing her into routine, and routine she understood now was far more powerful than fear. That night, as the radio spoke again about factories and ships and distances that could not be crossed by force alone, she did not feel awe. She felt something quieter, a strange, aching recognition. This was a country that did not need to explain itself to function. It did not require obedience shouted into shape. It simply expected people to show up, do the work, and go home when the day was done. She lay back and stared into the dark, listening to the steady breathing of the women around her. Somewhere far away, someone had once lived like this without thinking twice about it. And for the first time since her capture, she wondered not with hope, but with unease, how many generations had grown up believing this kind of order was normal, and what it would mean to leave a place where nothing extraordinary happened and realize that was the most extraordinary thing of all. The day the war ended did not arrive with silence. It arrived with noise. The radio came on earlier than usual, volume turned higher than anyone had bothered to adjust before. The voice carried farther, this time sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the morning air before breakfast had even been set on the table. She recognized the tone before she understood the words. Excitement. Relief. The kind of restraint that barely held itself together. Someone said it out loud first, half laughing, half breathless. Then someone else repeated it louder as if saying it again would make it real. The war's over. The words landed unevenly. A chair scraped back. A hand flew to a mouth. Someone laughed, a short, broken sound that startled even the person who made it. Another woman covered her face, shoulders shaking. Someone else whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken in years. She did not move. She stood where she was, hands still resting on the edge of the table, the grain of the wood familiar beneath her palms. The smell of coffee was already in the air. The skillet still sizzled exactly as it had every morning before. Everything was the same. That was what made it unbearable. Around her the day fractured. Voices rose. Tears came freely now, no longer hidden or restrained. Plans spilled out in fragments, home parents, streets rooms that might still exist. Someone grabbed her arm, smiling through tears. "We're going home." She nodded, because that was what was expected. Inside, nothing followed. Work was cancelled that day. Not announced, just unnecessary. Tools remained where they were. The fence could wait. The cattle did not need moving. Time loosened its grip and people wandered without purpose, unsure where to place their hands now that the future had suddenly returned. She found herself walking away from the others without deciding to. Past the barn, past the pump, toward the porch. The wooden boards were warm beneath her when she sat. The heat had already settled into the day, thick and unmoving. A breeze passed, once carrying the smell of earth-dry soil, trampled grass, something faintly metallic from the tools left out in the sun. She sat there alone. That was when it began. The letters arrived in the afternoon. Not ceremonially, not as announcements. They were handed out the way everything else had been, here quietly, efficiently, without commentary. Names called. Envelopes passed from one hand to another. When her name was spoken, she felt it register somewhere far away as if it belonged to someone else. The paper was thin. The edges soft from handling. She recognized the handwriting immediately and wished she didn't. She opened it slowly. The words did not rush at her. They waited, heavy and precise. The city was gone. Not damaged, gone. Whole streets erased into rubble that no one had the strength to clear. Buildings reduced to outlines and memory. The bakery on the corner where she had once waited in line no longer existed. The tram lines ended abruptly in twisted metal. Food was scarce. Not rare scarce. Meals stretched thin, improvised, uncertain. People bartered objects they had once kept for sentiment. Shoes, coats, anything that might be traded for something to eat. There was no work. Or, rather, there was work everywhere but no structure, no tools, no pay. People moved constantly searching for places that might be better than where they stood, even when they didn't know what direction better might be. The letter did not beg. That was what undid her. It simply stated facts one after another without drama or accusation, as if the writer had learned not to expect rescue from words. She folded the letter carefully and sat very still. The sounds of celebration drifted from somewhere behind her, louder voices raised in disbelief, the kind of noise people make when release comes too suddenly to be graceful. She stayed where she was. The porch creaked faintly as the heat expanded the wood. Somewhere nearby, an insect buzzed, then fell silent. The smell of the land pressed in around her, familiar now in a way it hadn't been weeks ago. She tried to picture going back. Not the journey, the place. She tried to imagine waking to a morning without coffee ready, without work waiting, without a day that knew what it was for. The image would not form. Her chest tightened slow and relentless. She pressed a hand flat against it, surprised by the pressure there, by the insistence of it. This was not fear. This was grief. The realization arrived quietly without argument. Going home felt like punishment. Not because she did not love the place she had come from, but because that place no longer existed in the way she needed it to. The country she was being sent back to was not the one she had left, and she was not the person who had been taken. The ranch behind her did not celebrate. No flags were raised, no speeches were given. The man in the hat nodded when he heard the news, said only, "Figured it'd come sooner or later," and went back to what he was doing. The normality of that response broke something open inside her. She had braced herself for cruelty, for punishment, for deprivation. She had not prepared for the moment she would be asked to leave a place that had not hurt her. Her shoulders began to shake before she understood why. She pressed her lips together, trying to keep the sound contained. The first tear fell anyway, landing on the back of her hand, hot and unfamiliar. Then another. She did not cry loudly. She cried the way people cry when they are trying not to be seen. Her body folded forward slightly, elbows resting on her knees, head bowed. The heat did not relent. The smell of dirt remained steady. The porch did not creak again. No one came out to check on her. That, too, mattered. She cried for the routine she would lose, for the days that would no longer repeat themselves with such quiet certainty, for the fact that she had learned what it felt like to be useful without being humiliated, fed without being indebted, corrected without being shamed. She cried because she had discovered too late what safety felt like. And safety, it turned out, was not something she could pack and take with her. When the tears finally slowed, she stayed where she was, eyes swollen, breathing uneven. The letter lay folded beside her. Behind her, somewhere inside the house, the radio played again, still talking about ships, about movement, about things going forward, whether people were ready or not. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and sat up straight. For the first time since her capture, she did not feel broken. She felt changed. And that she understood with a clarity that hurt more than fear ever had was something no barbed wire or rifle could have accomplished. They had not defeated her here. They had not crushed her. They had shown her another way to live. And now they were sending her back to a world that no longer knew how. That was the real punishment. And it was one she would carry with her long after the fences were gone. The morning after the tears, she expected distance. That was how endings usually announce themselves, by withdrawal, by a sudden tightening of rules, by faces that turned careful words, that shortened kindness, that learned how to look like formality. Instead, the day began the same way it always had. Coffee first, the radio low, the skillet already hot. Nothing in the sequence acknowledged that anything had changed. That unsettled her more than the news itself. She worked that day because there was work to be done. Not because anyone ordered her to. Not because she wanted to prove something. Because the fence still needed attention and the sun was already climbing. Her hands moved without hesitation. The post driver rose and fell in a rhythm she no longer had to think about. The ache returned to her shoulders, familiar and strangely welcome. This, she realized, was the final lesson. Not mercy, not forgiveness, competence. The man in the hat worked alongside her for a while, saying nothing. When a post went in crooked, he didn't stop her. He waited until she saw it herself. She pulled it out and reset it without looking at him. He nodded once. That was all. At midday, they broke for water. She drank deeply, wiped her mouth, and waited for something, anything to mark the moment as different. It never came. In the late afternoon, when the heat softened and shadows stretched long across the dirt, he called it. Tools were returned. Buckets emptied. The workday closed itself without ceremony. She stood there for a moment, hands hanging at her sides, unsure what to do next. Not because she lacked instruction, but because she understood what was coming. He approached her then. Not quickly, not deliberately. Just the same pace he always walked, boots scuffing lightly against the ground. He stopped a few steps away, close enough that she could see the dust caught in the seams of his shirt, the crease where the brim of his hat had shaped itself over years. He extended his hand. No preamble, no speech. The gesture caught her off guard so completely that she hesitated. Her hand rose slowly as if it belonged to someone else. When their palms met, the contact was firm but brief, calloused, warm, ordinary. He held it for a second longer than necessary, then let go. "You worked, honest," he said. "Not well, not hard, honest." The word landed with a weight she hadn't expected. There was no praise in his tone, no judgment either, just a statement of fact the way one might remark on weather or daylight. Then he stepped back. That was the end of it. She stood there long after he had turned away, the echo of the handshake still present in her arm. No contract had been offered, no forgiveness granted, no absolution requested. Nothing had been exchanged except recognition. And in that moment, she understood. This was not kindness as performance. This was confidence. A confidence so complete it did not need to announce itself, did not need to humiliate anyone to prove its strength. A confidence that assumed its own continuity and therefore had no use for cruelty. She thought back to everything she had been taught about power, that it required fear, that it demanded submission, that enemies had to be broken so they would never rise again. Here, power looked like something else entirely. It looked like abundance that did not need to hoard, like order that did not need to shout, like standards that applied even when no one was watching. No one here had tried to erase her past. No one had asked her to confess beliefs. No one had demanded gratitude. They had simply expected her to work, to eat, to sleep, and to do it again the next day. That expectation, that quiet insistence on normalcy had done what fear never could. It had changed her, not because she had been forced to admire it, but because she had lived inside it long enough to recognize its shape. That evening, as the radio spoke again in its steady, untroubled voice, about ships still moving about, factories still running about, distances still being crossed, she listened differently. She did not hear triumph. She heard continuity. A country so certain of itself that it could afford restraint. So confident in its foundations that it did not need to strip dignity from its enemies to feel secure. The thought followed naturally without bitterness. What would this country look like without that? Once stepped back, and that was the end. She walked toward the truck without looking behind her. Not because she was afraid to, but because she understood that this place did not require a final look to be remembered. It had already done its work. As the truck pulled away, she watched the ranch recede, shrinking not into insignificance, but into something quieter shape that would remain no matter how far she traveled. The road stretched ahead. The bundle rested on her lap light enough to forget she was holding it. She searched it absently for weight for proof of experience and found none. What she carried could not be folded. It had no edges. It had no smell. It was simply a standard. The memory of a hand offering food before asking a name. The sound of a radio playing because someone liked the music. The certainty that work done honestly was enough. When the train came later and the ocean after that, she did not mark the miles the way she once had. Distance no longer frightened her. Disorder did. On the ship, she stood at the rail and watched America disappear, not with bitterness, not with longing, but with a careful attention, usually reserved for things that might not be seen again in the same form. She knew what waited on the other side. Cities that did not function. Institutions that had collapsed under their own weight. People who had learned to survive without trusting anything larger than themselves. She would not speak often of where she had been. Not because she wanted to protect it, but because she knew words would flatten it. Turn it into something smaller than it had been. She would speak instead of habits. Of getting up when there was work to do. Of returning tools to their place. Of feeding people before judging them. Years later, when the fences were long gone and the uniforms packed away, her children would ask what captivity had been like. She would pause before answering. Not because the memory hurt, but because she knew how easily the wrong details could be chosen. She would not describe guards or gates. She would talk about coffee, about the way time had been kept, about how no one had ever asked her to perform gratitude. And somewhere else in another house, an American family would sit around a table and talk about the war in much the same way. They would not speak of moral superiority. They would speak of work, of long days, of neighbors who showed up. That was the connection no one had planned for. Not reconciliation, recognition. Now, years later, still the question remains. Quiet, persistent, and unresolved. Not a challenge, an inventory. If another war came. Not tomorrow, not soon, but someday, would this country still be able to do that? Would it still trust systems more than fear? Confidence. She imagined the systems she had seen here quiet, disciplined, unadorned, replaced by suspicion. By noise. By the need to constantly explain and justify and accuse. She imagined work no longer trusted to speak for itself. Standards no longer shared. Faith in institutions replaced by fear of them. The image disturbed her, because she knew now that this kind of strength was not guaranteed. It had been built, maintained, chosen day after day by people who did not consider themselves moral heroes, only responsible ones. She lay down that night with the window open, listening to the land breathe. The insects sang. The air cooled. Somewhere a door closed gently. She did not cry. She did not pray. She simply lay there aware that she had witnessed something rare. A form of power that did not need cruelty to sustain itself. A country that, at its strongest, did not ask to be admired, only to be understood by how it behaved when no one was forcing it to behave well. And she understood now why leaving hurt so much. Because what she was leaving behind was not comfort. It was certainty. The certainty that strength could coexist with decency. That order did not require humiliation. That enemies did not have to be broken to be defeated. She turned onto her side, eyes open in the dark, and held on to that knowledge as tightly as she could. It was the only thing she was sure she would be allowed to take with her. The last morning arrived without ceremony. No announcement, no bugle, no raised voices to mark the occasion. The sky looked the same as it had every other morning, wide pale, already warming. The insects had not adjusted their rhythm to history. The land did not pause. She packed what little she had into a small bundle that felt lighter than it should have. There were no souvenirs to sort through, no objects that needed deciding. Everything she had used here had belonged to the place itself, tools returned to Hook's cups washed and set back where they had always been, blankets folded and left behind. Nothing was meant to be taken. That, too, was part of the lesson. Outside, the truck waited with its engine off. The man in the hat stood nearby, hands resting loosely at his sides, not watching her, not hurrying her. He looked toward the fields instead, checking the angle of the light the way he always did. She stepped onto the porch one last time. The wood was cool now. The heat had not yet settled in. She could smell earth again, steady, familiar. The radio murmured faintly from inside the house, its voice low and unimportant, talking about schedules and places she would never see. No one mentioned the war. No one mentioned victory. She stopped a few steps from him, unsure whether to speak. There were no words that fit. Gratitude felt too small. Explanation felt unnecessary. He turned, then sensing her presence rather than responding to it. They stood facing each other in the quiet. For a moment, she thought he might say something, offer advice perhaps, or ask where she would go. He didn't. He simply raised his hand again the same way he had the afternoon before. She took it. The handshake was the same. Firm, brief, unremarkable. Nothing new was added to it. He nodded. Would it still feed first and ask later? Would it still believe that strength did not require humiliation to be real? Or was that kind of confidence something that could only exist once built by people who had known scarcity and therefore understood restraint maintained by routines so ordinary they never thought to defend them? She had left without gifts, without keepsakes, without proof. But she had carried something across the ocean that could not be confiscated. The knowledge that once power had looked like decency, practiced quietly, without applause. And that the most important victories were not the ones announced on the radio, but the ones that changed how people treated each other when no one was watching. The truck moved on. The road continued. Behind her, the place she had left returned to its rhythm, unconcerned with legacy. Ahead of her, the future waited, messy, uncertain, demanding choices. And the question lingered unanswered where it belonged. If another war came, would we still be that country?